The death of Queen Elizabeth II gives us an opportunity not only to mourn the death of an individual, but to examine the meaning of death in our culture more broadly and what the symbol of Queen Elizabeth represents to an entire population of not just a country, but to some degree, a planet. I'm wearing black as a mark of respect to the many people in services, to the older generation, to the people even younger than me that will consider Queen Elizabeth II to be a significant figure and a representative of our nation. I'm wearing black too because she's a human being who has been ubiquitously present in the lives of everybody. She's been a queen, our queen, for 70 years. Unless you're around 80 years old, you can't recall a time. She is a ubiquitous, unquestioned part of our culture. Even when you inquire about the nature of monarchy, the nature of power, the corruption that those symbols can bring about, even when you consider that no power of that magnitude can ever be achieved without enforcement, corruption, imperialism, colonization, there's a level where the Queen is present in all of our lives that goes beyond morality. It's an unquestioned and seemingly natural order. It is the symbol of our nation. There is no Britain in some ways without the monarchy, for Britain is a monarchy, and Queen Elizabeth II is the longest serving monarch that we've ever had. She's on our stamps, our money, every post box. I've got no memory from my life that doesn't in some way have as a backdrop the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. In death, when you start to examine something retrospectively, it's astonishing to think that this is a person that met JFK and Jackie Onassis, that gave the World Cup to Bobby Moore, that's been around while all sorts of leaders and even empires have come and gone, a constant presence. In this constancy, we find a certain stability. But if we examine it, it's also a symbol of our inability to bring about real change. On this channel, we talk a lot about systems of corruption and the impossibility of real change in the lives of ordinary people, as long as there are entrenched systems that don't respond to the requirements of ordinary people. This is, of course, not a judgment of the individual human Queen Elizabeth II, who none of us, other than a very limited circle of people, have any potential to understand or to know. The success of that show, The Crown, demonstrates our intrigue. This is a folk tale come to life. It's been often said of Elizabeth II that it was her kind of de facto stoicism, her reserved persona that allowed us to project onto her, that she considered it her duty to be a symbol. This dutifulness is one of the things that you'll hear spoken about and espoused in many of the obituaries that will come in the following days. For the people of Britain, there's going to be 10 days of mourning. There's going to be the transition to a new monarch, King Charles III. The idea that the monarchy can withstand this death is potentially absurd. It's going to take a lot of engineering and a lot of consideration. Queen Elizabeth's power was unquestioned because there's nobody, hardly, that remembers life without her. The first Prime Minister that she met with was Winston Churchill, and Winston Churchill's death was the last death that was mourned on this scale. Of course, in this country, the death of Princess Diana was incredibly resonant, but in some ways, Diana stands as the antithesis to the monarchical power. Diana was a challenge to this power. Diana was the emergence in some ways of the new emotionalism, the kind of mournography, public grieving, the expression of grief and pain and sadness and romance and love and loss that the Queen stands in direct opposition to. I have so much respect for the generations that went before me, that fought in world wars, that built this country, that built the National Health Service. And many of them did that with the kind of unconscious and unquestioning, and in some case devoted image of Queen Elizabeth II as the fulcrum. I know people who've, Gareth, who I work with, just said that when his granddad got a centenary letter from Her Majesty the Queen, it was one of the most important moments in his life. I'm respectful to all those values. I'm also, as a person that's interested in mysticism, fascinated by the power that she had. I'm fascinated that, in a sense, the Queen had to do so little to win back public affection after it was challenged around the time of Diana's death, that all it took was a kind of maternal, matriarchal gaze to win back the hearts of the British people. Those of you that know that I'm interested in esoteric spirituality will know that I will look at her as a matriarch, as a great mother, as all of our mothers, in a sense, in a way that's so deeply embedded, even if you don't agree with the monarchy, even if you don't like royalty, even if you see it as a symbol of privilege. Who among us hasn't railed against their own parents in exactly that type of way? You'll have heard me say before that in a culture that extracts the divine feminine from its practices, i.e. we are a Protestant culture, broadly speaking, albeit a secular one, we don't have the figure of the mother, Mary, we don't have that aspect properly represented. So a powerful queen, I think, is a sort of an expression of that repressed femininity. All the time when people are talking about the need to change the relationships, the aspects of femininity, patriarchal power, will be cognizant of the fact that in British culture there is this potent female symbol that is sort of actually is definitively female, but almost beyond womanhood. She is a signifier in a literal way of female power, in a way that goes beyond feminism, I would argue. Certainly her tenure and her reign predates feminism in any manner that we might discuss it. The loss of Queen Elizabeth II will obviously bring about in the coming days and weeks, months and years a conversation, coming as it does at a time of crisis, a time, in fact, that is defined by crisis, where we go from the war against terror into very real wars in Europe, into wars against germs and lockdowns and pandemics and culture wars, ecological crisis, the division around the framing of ecological crisis, the political crisis that we're currently facing, the cost of living crisis. This death will be seen as a part of that. It will be seen as a symbol of this time of transition and renewal. And my truthful opinion is that it has to be seen as that this time has ended. When Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II ascended to the throne, the cultural revolution of the 1960s hadn't happened, let alone the kind of mauling of those ideals in the 1970s, the emergence of the individualism of the 80s, the kind of new fast-paced hyper-reality of the 90s, and wherever it is we are now in this new millennium, this kind of technologically advanced, atomized culture where tradition just seems to be a kind of cultural tool. Perhaps it's only ever been a cultural tool, but something that we've lost real contact with. She is arced like one of the many rainbows that illuminated the sky curiously yesterday across an epoch. She defines an epoch. Whether or not you agree with royalty, whether or not you agree with privilege and the kind of power that you have to accept that Elizabeth II represents, she's an extremely wealthy person, the oaths are still sworn, Her Majesty's postal services, Her Majesty's prisons. This is deep, deep, deep in British culture. It is British culture. You take that away, you've got to redefine what Britain is. What's the next? The Beatles? You know, where do you go after the Queen? The Beatles. And she was Queen when those guys were, you'll have to look down at these kids. You know, like, that's how long it is. That's how much he's held there. And it could only be a person that transcended individual identity that would be able to carry that kind of weight. And now the reality is that the Queen, as all human beings must, has died. And she leaves us with a lot of questions. And I think a lot of people are going to rush to find answers. And I don't want to be one of those people. I would just like to present to you and to suggest to you that all of the questions that have come about in recent years still remain unanswered. What type of society do we want to live in? What do we consider democracy to be? What is it to be British or American or French or Somalian? What are we trying to achieve here? If you have a figure that represents ultimately our shared connection with one another and with God, and that figure dies at a time when we are confused and fractured as a culture, when we are generally speaking fearful and doubtful, at a time when people are analysing power very deeply and analysing identity in a way that's never been done before, as far as I know, then certain questions will eventually have to be asked. What kind of culture do you want to live in? How should power be organised? How might ordinary people live? What do we do about all of these varying cultures that don't see eye to eye on a great many issues? Is it even possible now to have a nation like Great Britain or a nation like the United States of America? How does it benefit ordinary people? Can the case still be made that having one centralised authority benefits people at large? I'm certainly not pretending that I can answer such a huge question, or that this is the right time to start addressing it. I am respectful of the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II, in so much as she was an individual that devoted her life to what she did, and she played the hand she was dealt as well as she could have done. I'm respectful to the many people that will feel deep sadness now, and I include myself among them, because the world is changing and Britain has just changed significantly. I'm also not going to pretend that I'm a person that agrees with royalty more broadly, because I can't help but think that it is the central symbol of elitism and privilege, and helps to insert in our collective consciousness that it's okay for wealth and power to be concentrated in certain areas in a way that negates the welfare and well-being of many, many ordinary people. I think that that is a question that has to be asked. I am respectful of the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II and respectful of the death of Queen Elizabeth II, as I would be of any human being, but this is not any human being. This is a symbol, and symbols can be mutable. There is not a universal Queen Elizabeth II. She will mean many things to many people, but she means something to all of us, and I'm respectful of that fact. But I'm mindful most of all that this has come at an interesting time, that we're going to be invited over the next 10 days to experience various ceremonies, and those ceremonies I hope will be deeply cathartic for the many people wounded by her passing. But part of what we'll be invited to do is transfer whatever degree of allegiance we have to the institution in its new form. And many of you will have questions about that. Many of you that are not British will be curious about how that may unravel and unfold. Perhaps this is a time for review. Perhaps it is in the same way as perhaps in the United States, seeing a figure like Trump, then a figure like Biden, and observing the fluctuations and the continuity that has come within those apparent variations. Perhaps what this suggests most deeply is we are entering into a time of real reflection and real change. And to pretend that there is stability and constancy is illusory. The only constancy is change. It is a deep truth and unavoidable, indefatigable reality of all our lives that our form and our lives here is temporal and temporary. And to pretend that it isn't, I believe, leads to materialism, elitism, concentration of power. I believe we have to access deep spirit. And what I mean by that is what we feel we are beyond what we have. What ability we have to control others, what ability we have to control ourselves, that we find in ourselves a relationship with kindness and compassion and duty, and that we have a spirit of discernment, integrity, and inquiry in the way that we approach life. So, of course, like anyone that's British, and perhaps like anyone in the world, I mourn with everybody the death of an incredible human being who lived an incredible, incomparable life. But I also am aware that after this period of mourning, many questions that have long been present in a lot of people's minds will have to be resolved. What is it to be British? What is it to be American? How ought the world be run, and for whose benefit? But for today, perhaps I will simply join all of you in paying respects to Queen Elizabeth II, a human being who it's impossible to imagine Britain without, but now we're going to have to.